Welcome to the Prescott Today show. My name is Harry Oberg. I'm the Mayor of Prescott. I have with me today two gentlemen from the Reason Foundation, Pete Constant and Leonard Gilroy. Before we actually get into more introductions and talking about why they're here, I'd like to try and do a little preface as to what we're trying to get accomplished today. And you know, when I was running for mayor, I had a lot of people come up to me and indicate that the two major problems that they saw facing Prescott was both the public pension retirement system, the fact that we're about $72 million in debt right now, and also drug rehab homes, and you know what kind of problems we were having with those in the neighborhoods. So today we're going to be talking about the public safety retirement system, pension system, and you know, a lot of people told me at the time, because there was also a ballot measure about 0.55% sales tax that was on the same ballot in which I was elected mayor, in which we were going to try and pay down some of this debt on the PSPRS. And I was even told before the election occurred that many people probably wouldn't support the increase in sales tax because there was no reform of the system. They felt that, you know, we had a bleeding wound, and you know, we had to stop the bleeding before people would really get serious about thinking about how we're going to pay this thing down. And as it turned out, that's exactly the way it happened in the election. The 0.55 was turned down, and so once I became mayor, I started working very closely with the League of Cities and Towns, and also with Senator Lesko of the state senate, to try and see what she was doing to get reform of the system. And so fortunately, they happened to get a hold of some people in the Reason Foundation, which happened to be you folks. And I think we had some significant successes there. As a matter of fact, the legislation that she brought forth was recently approved and signed by the governor. So we're going to be talking about that today and how that all occurred. So I think what I'd like to start off with first is if you could just briefly introduce yourselves and your backgrounds, and then we'll go into who the Reason Foundation is and how you got involved in being called in by Senator Lesko to help with the reform here in Arizona. So we'll start with Pete first.
Well, thank you, Mayor. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I've been with the Reason Foundation for just about a year, and my entire year has been spent working on this Arizona pension reform. It's been a great year and a great experience. Prior to this, I served on the San Jose City Council in California for 8 years, and prior to that, served as a police officer in the city of San Jose. So I have some expertise and experience from that of a public safety officer, from that of a legislator who's trying to deal with the pension issues and the impacts that it has on budgets, but I also served as a trustee on 2 different pension system boards, 2 multi-billion-dollar pension funds. So during that time, I got an opportunity to really learn about how pension systems work, sometimes why they don't work, how different factors impact those pensions, which have the ripple down effect to city budgets. So that is what prompted me to get involved with the Reason Foundation, to try and bring all those different experiences to bear on trying to fix some of these vexing problems that we see with public pensions.
And what's your title at the Reason Foundation?
I'm the director of the Pension Integrity Project.
Okay. Leonard?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm Leonard Gilroy. I'm the Director of Government Reform at Reason Foundation, and I work on a variety of primarily tax and fiscal issues, policy issues, at primarily the state and local level for Reason Foundation. I cover a lot of ground there. I guess you could say I'm a jack of all trades in a lot of different ways. But tax, fiscal policy, government contracting, infrastructure, urban policy issues have been some of the issues that I've focused on. But for the last few years, I've been part of our pension project team that Pete just described. And just by way of background, what is Reason Foundation? Reason Foundation is a national nonprofit think tank. We approach public policy issues from a free market perspective. We've been around for almost 40 years now. We've done, and we're a national think tank. I happen to be based in Arizona. I'm based down in the valley in Fountain Hills, outside of Scottsdale. Pete's from California, as he mentioned. But we work on pension reform and other issues nationally. We do some federal work as well. Our areas, policy areas that we cover outside of tax and fiscal sorts of issues, we cover education reform, infrastructure, aviation, surface transportation policy, environmental policy, a number of different areas. But pensions are one that has been a particular interest of ours for many years now. Over a decade ago, we wrote a study that looked at what back then we thought was a looming coming crisis in the public pension arena, where the promises and commitments that governments were making at all levels of government in terms of their public employee retiree pension obligations were exceeding what they had saved in the bank, so to speak, to cover those costs. And back then, the amount of the problem was somewhere in the $500 billion deficit sort of arena. If you fast forward to today, depending on whose numbers and what assumptions you use, at the national level, that deficit between what you've committed and what you have on hand to pay those commitments tallies somewhere in the $1 to $4 trillion range. So it's a significant problem, but that has been an issue that Reason has focused on for many years now. And a few years ago, we launched a project where we wanted to help public policymakers sort of understand and learn the issue to be able to make meaningful reforms.
Okay, great. And so I guess Senator Lesko started working on this about a year ago, and I'm not sure when she actually brought you folks in, but maybe you can explain how you got involved with her in working on this project.
Sure. Well, I've known Senator Lesko for a number of years now, and she mentioned an interest in the pension issue, and at the same time, about a year ago, you had the public safety unions in this state that were bringing forward a proposal where they were recognizing that there was a problem with the state's public safety personnel retirement system. We'll shorthand that to PSPRS. They recognized that there was a problem, and you had communities like Prescott, which were facing, as you mentioned, I think you said today, it's $72 million in unfunded liabilities, and that's projected to increase. You have other communities like Bisbee and South Tucson and others that have similar challenges, and if you look across the state, a number of them have significant challenges, and that prompted the unions, which is a pretty unique situation nationally, to come to the table proactively with a reform concept. Senator Lesko convened what you might call a stakeholder working group that included folks from the League of Cities, it included the public safety unions, it included what you might call the taxpayer advocate groups like ours. And it just so happened that we had this project where when she was needing resources to basically to deploy into this situation, we had that project. We had just, I think we were in the midst of bringing you on board at that time to lead the project. We had resources to devote to doing the actuarial work. That's basically the number crunching work that goes behind public pensions. It's very complicated math, so to speak. But we were willing to bring that to the table and do our part to sort of help that effort move forward and evaluate what were the unions proposing. Was that the right reform? Were there other things that should be on the table? And that essentially, her efforts kickstarted a process that culminated last month in the passage of legislation.
Right. And as I understand it, the unions were, you were quite apart from the unions on what had to be done. And you had a tremendous effort in trying to make them understand the numbers, how, the pension reform could actually benefit them and benefit the taxpayer too.
Yeah.
And so you might want to just talk about that for a moment, because I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, pension plans are very complex. Not only how they work, but how they're accounted for and what impacts them. And sometimes something will sound very rational, and if you just do A, you'll fix the problem. But when you get into the actuarial valuation process, when you look at the long-term effects, it's really not that simple. So one of the things that we had to do is first educate people on not only what is a pension system and how it operates, but what are those levers that really make a difference. There's a lot of changes that you can make that might sound or feel good but have very little impact. There's others that may not look like they have an impact, but when you look at the long-term effects, they can be quite substantial. So what we did is we talked with the unions and all the stakeholders and said, well, now that we've helped you understand how they work, let's look at all the possible alternatives, even some that may not be palatable. But if someone has an idea, let's look at it. Let's see how it affects the pension, Does it raise costs, lower costs, short-term gains, long-term gains? What are the real impacts over time? And will it address what really is the problem? Additionally, we had to look at the system and the different levels of the system to determine what the problems are, because we know that pension systems across the U.S. are in crisis right now, but they're all in crisis for slightly different reasons. So we really had to pinpoint that. Then, complicating the matter even further, you have a legal environment that makes it very difficult to make changes to pension systems. So we also had to help everyone understand the legal constraints both in your Arizona Constitution and in the U.S. Constitution, along with a myriad of different court cases that have provided case law guidance on how you do this, and then put together a reform that not only had meaningful impact and long-term savings, but was palatable to both sides, both the employers and the employees, and would meet all the legal challenges and questions. And that is where I think we were able to sort of be that middle person or the consensus builder, because we were able to talk to each of the different groups because we had no real stake in the actual outcome. We're an outside organization that doesn't stand to personally benefit one way or another. We were here just really to be expert resources.
Right. And it was interesting that when I went down for Senator Lesko's Senate hearing, where she was doing the final work to actually bring the bills forward for a vote, many of the unions got up and they were very positive about the changes that are being made, and it sounded like they're supporting it. I'd probably say 100%. Is that what you felt?
I don't know if I would go to 100%. There are a number of different labor organizations, and the ones that support it are fully 100% supportive. There's still a few outliers that have some concerns more about process and constitutional issues, and is this something you really want to change the Constitution for, and things of that nature. But everybody has pretty much universally agreed on what the problem is and what the components of the solution are. They just want to take slightly different paths to get there. But the overwhelming majority of labor organizations, elected representatives both on both party sides, and taxpayer advocates have all been supportive of this, because it really changes how the system functions and makes meaningful change going forward.
Yeah, and I know the League of Cities and Towns was very much behind this. They were instrumental in getting support for this, and we're very happy with that, I can tell you. Now, I asked you some time back to take, after the legislation was passed and signed, to take a look at how that's going to affect Prescott specifically. I want to know, what kind of cost savings path are we going to see as we go out 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Because I think, you were here yesterday with the city council, you briefed them, and I think they saw, the results of that study that you did just for Prescott. And I think most of them were, maybe a little unhappy that things don't resolve themselves much more quickly. And of course, it does nothing to take care of the $72 million debt. This is really moving forward and stopping the bleeding so that we have a chance to pay this thing off without seeing continued money being added, sometimes exponentially, to our bill. So I think that's the first thing I want to preface. Also, you had some slides yesterday, which you'll be discussing here as we move forward. So I think the first thing I would like to talk about is, how did we get here? How did we get so far in the hole?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll start with it. There's a number of issues that came to bear. As you know, economic cycles are can be very extreme. We had some very difficult times in the 2001 recession, in the 2008 recession, and those pension funds that are contributed by cities like yours and state agencies are put in a variety of investments for the long term. It's looking, how can we use this money over not just the career of an individual, but over their entire lifespan to make sure that we have a benefit to pay them out. Well, when you have a system like this that is subject to the market, you really have to look at a couple things. One is, how do you respond to the market? Can the pension board make changes to reflect the new realities that we see ourselves in? But also, are market cycles strong enough to correct the downs that you see? And we found two things that were causing significant problems. One is, there is a benefit increase for retirees called a permanent benefit increase. Most of your viewers will see it as a cost of living adjustment. when someone who's retired gets an increase in their benefit to help them deal with the rising costs of living. The benefit that was designed for PSPRS was designed so that in years when the fund exceeded its expected performance, anything that was above 9% returns in the general portfolio of investments, half of those excess earnings would be taken out of the system and put on the side to provide benefits for those retirees. That had two problems with it. One is you were taking one-time money, one-year investment funds, and increasing someone's retirement for the rest of their life. So you took one-time money and created an ongoing obligation. That adds liabilities to your plan. The other thing is because of the cycles of the market, it's almost impossible to recover from a down market if you don't use all of your money in an up market. And that's exactly what PSPRS saw, that while they expected to earn anywhere from 9, and then they modified their expectations to about 7.5% return on their investments over time, they were in actuality only getting about a 5% return over the last dozen years. Mm-hmm. And that just means that every year more debt was put into the system. Mm-hmm. And that debt rose exponentially.
So what you're telling me then is that in good years, they skimmed off maybe the extra earnings, and instead of keeping those for a safety net to keep the system solvent for those years that you had a downturn.
That's right.
And I believe you have a chart that shows that approximately about 2002, we were pretty much paid up in this state.
That's right. In 2002, the PSPRS system was 100% funded and had no unfunded liabilities, meaning it had the money to cover all of its obligations.
So this would be your first chart?
That's the first chart.
Okay.
Fast forward to today, about 12 years later, 13 years later, the system has accumulated $6.6 billion in unfunded liabilities. That's billion with a B, and it is only 48% funded. And so you can see there's been a mountain of debt that's been created, and that's debt that, by the very nature of the pension system, is on the backs of the taxpayers. And that is why, major contributing factor to why Prescott is seeing the unfunded liabilities that it's seeing. That's sort of your $72 million is its portion of that system. And statewide, that's been the dynamic statewide too. And so those $6.6 billion are spread out across municipalities like Prescott statewide, and that's a real problem. And especially when you consider that over the last few years, what you see is basically a declining trend in the PSPRS funded status at the very same time that the markets have been, with the exception of this year primarily, as of June, July of last year, you had the markets at a peak, and you had markets that were really riding a bull market for many years. And so at the very same time the markets were rising, PSPRS's funded status was falling. So at the time you should have expected the pension fund to be able to regain some of the lost momentum from recessions. It wasn't able to, and that permanent benefit increase structure that Pete mentioned was a primary cause of that.
And I think it's important to note here that the city paid the bill that it was told to pay by the PSPRS board.
That's right.
I've had people say to me, well, you were paying a minimum just like you can do on your own insurance payment. You can make the monthly or you can make an extended plan. We didn't do that. Whatever the cost was, that's exactly what we paid.
Yeah, that's really important to point out because, as Len pointed out, the financial markets were going up as the funded status was going down. All the agencies throughout the state were paying their bills as they were presented. They were paying exactly what the actuaries said they should pay, yet they continued to go further and further down in their funded status. And that's what really caught the attention of the employees and the labor unions, because they're looking at it saying, well, wait a minute. For every dollar you've promised our members in retirement, you have less than 50 cents in your pocket to pay for it? How does that provide security for our members, our employees, and our retirees who are really going to be worried about this when they're 60, 70, 80, 90, many years after retirement, and find out there's no money there to pay them? Mm-hmm. And really, is that fair to the employees, as well as is it fair to the taxpayers to create all this debt that's generating essentially interest payments and raising the costs and raising the uncertainty at the same time? So that's why we really had to get in and see, what are these driving factors? Why is PSPRS not responding to an up market? Because as Len said, if you're this poorly funded at the top of a financial market, what's going to happen the next time the market goes down. I can't tell you when that will be, but I can tell you the market will go down, and that's going to have a devastating effect on the plan.
Right. And I think it's important to note that in my discussions with the folks in Phoenix, basically the legislature, they indicated to me that early on some of the increase in debt was based on bad investments. And that's one of the problems that we have is the governing board, I don't think, was as efficient as it should have been, and the policies probably and their investment strategies were not coherent. And as a result, we had a number of bad investments, and that caused a pretty significant dip in the value of the market or the value of the securities. And as a result, that started building the increase in our debt. And then, of course, if looking at your chart, the last portion really starts to rise very quickly and putting us substantially in debt. And I attribute that to the Fields case. And that was basically where the elected officials of the state decided that they wanted to get back to the 4% COLA from the fact that it had been cut to 2% in 2012, or 2011, I'm sorry.
That's right.
And so they, sued to get that reinstated, and they were successful. And I think that's where we really start seeing a major look at the actuarial value of the entire PSPRS funding. And people realize that, we haven't been doing what we need to really understand the risks that we have here. And that's the reason why you see the spike as you look at the chart. So I think one of the things I'd like to go into now is just talk a little bit about the risk. The fact that, they indicate in the past that they would get 9%, and then I think it's been dropping down when they realized they couldn't get 9%, so they went down to 8 and 7.85, I think, this last year, and now they've finally gone down to 7.5. You just indicated a few minutes ago that, really, they're lucky to get 5 as an average. Mm-hmm. So why don't you explain that a little bit, how that creates a tremendous amount of risk for us?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is, as we mentioned about this cost of living adjustment that skims those high returns, essentially what you do is you punish the fund for having good performance. So the board, seeing that every time they had really good performance, monies would be taken away and they'd actually be worse off than if they had mediocre performance, changed their investment strategy, not trying to achieve great results for the system because they didn't want to be punished, instead of really addressing the problem. And you tie that into the fact that other reforms had been made, as you mentioned, and reversed by the courts because they were made more arbitrarily. Well, let's just do this and it'll fix the problem without having that real in-depth analysis. And there's something fundamentally wrong with a system when the people who are sitting at the table making the decisions bear no burden of the risk. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what was happening in the PSPRS system. You have a board that came together and made in not only investment decisions, but actuarial valuation decisions, a myriad of different decisions, not just one board, but 256 boards across the state that were making decisions in conjunction with a state board that didn't have to pay the price directly if they were wrong, because that went to the deep pockets of the taxpayer. Mm-hmm. And 20, 30, 40 years ago, the investment market was completely different. You could make these types of return without taking on excess risk. So it was an easy game for the board members to achieve that return. But fast forward to now, where you have a market where in order to get 9 or even 7.5% sustained over multiple decades, you have to bring a lot of risk into your plan. And when you constrain how you make your investments because you want to make just 7.5 and you don't want to make any more than that, because if you do, you'll be punished, you create an environment where it's sort of a lose-lose situation. And so one of the fundamental things with the new legislation is it really changes the governance structure of the board so that those who bear the risk are the ones making the decision. And we believe that will lead to much better decision-making and professionalism in the future. Mm-hmm.
And I like your second chart in which you show the line of what they expected to get as a rate of return, and then your red line, which goes well below that. And for a number of years, they stay consistently below it. And I know when you briefed the unions and the employees on this, they had always been told by the board that, at some point that red line would go back up and, the system would be healthy again. But that didn't occur. And I think that was over pretty extended period of time, wasn't it?
That's right. You had a period of about 12 years where the board had an assumed rate of return of somewhere between 7.5% to 8%, but we're only hitting consistently a maximum of 5%, and sometimes it was dipping below that. And so you had a pretty significant gap there between what was expected and what they were actually getting on an actuarial basis. And what I mean by that is when you look at sort of just like someone is looking at their 401k statement, their own retirement statement, you see lots of fluctuations in what the markets or your investment portfolio is returning in any given year. And pension systems try to smooth that out a bit by spreading that out over a number of years. In this case, it's about 5 years. So that you don't have to deal with all those sort of ups and downs. And basically that's the numbers, or that's the set of numbers that matters most when you're talking about what a city like Prescott is contributing to the system. Because they try to smooth that out so that you don't have your contribution rates every year just wildly skyrocketing and then dropping, so that you have some predictability in what your budget looks like. And so that's been a real problem, is that on the actuarial basis, what really matters is that they've come not only short, but significantly short over a sustained period. And it's beyond the point at which you could say it was an anomaly. A year or two here or there, you might say, okay, we'd expect some variation. But when you have a consistent underperformance trend, that's a trend and that's a problem. And so hopefully, we're optimistic that some of the changes that have been made in this reform will provide a different decision-making structure, as Pete mentioned, and create better incentives for not only more professional management, but also just better decision-making all around in terms of all of the assumptions that go into determining what the costs are going to be.
And I think just as importantly, the union leaders and the employees got to really see what the difference between market rates and actuarial rates are, and they're going to be much more observant of what's going on in the system going forward.
Okay. And I think when we get done with our break here coming up, I'd like to go into briefly, what we have in the way of the 3 tiers, the retirees, the people that are currently working, and then the new legislation and how that's going to affect us, and how legislation affects in a very minor way, possibly, if this election, this initiative goes through on the ballot in May, how it could affect the retirees. But really going forward, what we're talking about is Tier 3, the new employees, and how that's going to affect them. We'll be back shortly, and with the Reason Foundation, Pete and Lynn Gilroy. Thank you. Welcome back to Prescott Today show. My name is Harry Oberg. I'm the Mayor of Prescott. I've had 2 people that come in to be my guests today, Pete Constant from the Reason Foundation, and also Lynn Gilroy from the Reason Foundation. If you missed what we were talking about earlier, we were basically talking about how we got into having a funding situation of $72 million debt for the public safety retirement system. I think we're going to move on now and talk about the legislation that was just recently approved and how it's going to change things moving forward, specifically for Prescott. So I guess, first of all, why don't we talk about the various tiers so people understand how all the previous legislation have been structured to form, the retirees and the current folks, and then we'll talk about the new tier that's going to be coming into effect next year.
I'll go ahead and take that one. So the PSPRS system, as you know, is one statewide system that has all the employees for state agencies and local municipalities and counties that are in public safety, police officers, firefighters, other related law enforcement professions. There are different tiers, as you mentioned, different benefit structures for people depending on when they were hired. Anybody who was hired before January 1 of 2012 and had more than 20 years of service on or was retired at that point is considered a Tier 1 employee. Anyone who was hired before that date but had less than 20 years on was a Tier 2 employee. We actually call them a Tier 2A employee because anyone who was hired after that date and up till the effective date of this new legislation was considered a Tier 2B employee. Each of those means slightly different benefits and how the benefit is administered and how it's costed out to the employers and the employee contributions.
And the Tier 2 right now is all active folks that are serving.
Well, there are probably some Tier 1 employees that are still actively serving.
Okay.
And there's definitely a lot of Tier 2A and Tier 2B
Okay.
employees, because you have people, some who've been working that started 30 years ago. But now anyone hired after July 1st of 2017 will be in the new benefit structure, which is commonly referred to as the Tier 3 structure. And there are a number of different changes in what their benefit looks like and how it's calculated and what the end result will be. But those are how the tiers break down.
Okay. So could you explain very briefly what's going to happen with the legislation if it's approved?
So the legislation is broken up into two parts.
I'm sorry, the ballot initiative.
The ballot initiative. The ballot initiative is one portion of the legislation. That legislation really only affects current employees and current retirees. So none of the Tier 3 employees that I mentioned will be affected by really the retroactive change that's going into the ballot measure. And what that will do is that ballot measure will address that broken cost of living adjustment that we spoke about in the first segment, where you have a permanent benefit increase that has been actually causing detrimental harm to the system. And it will replace that scheme that was created in the funding stream with a standard cost of living increase. And employees who retire in the future in tiers 1 or 2 and current retirees will see, instead of that permanent benefit increase, they'll receive an annual cost of living adjustment. In any year, there is an increase to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, for the Phoenix Mesa MSA that really looks at the cost of living here in Arizona. That increase will be limited to a maximum of 2%. But what this does is it not only fixes the fundamental flaw in how that benefit is structured and paid for and its impacts on the fund, but it will also provide certainty for retirees in the future. They know if there is going to be an increase in CPI, there will be a cost of living adjustment that goes with it.
And as I understand, right now, they didn't get a cost of living this year because actually the fund is insolvent. And I think the second thing to make sure the viewers understand is the reason why this has to go on the ballot is because we're actually changing the Arizona Constitution. Can you explain that briefly?
Sure. The Arizona State Constitution has a provision within it that you would commonly call the pension clause or the pension protection clause, which basically is designed to prevent making really any significant changes to benefits that have already been accrued, either from retirees themselves or through folks that are already currently working. It doesn't apply for folks that have not been hired yet. So what this ballot measure would do would be to modify, basically do a one-time opening of that pension protection clause to allow for the change that Pete just described, from changing from the broken permanent benefit increase structure to a more traditional cost of living adjustment.
Okay. So let's go on to what the other portion of the legislation does, which is really to create a Tier 3, a new type of hiring portfolio, I guess you could call it, for future people that are hired on after 1 July 2017.
Sure. Well, there are a number of provisions in the legislation, and so we'll just summarize those here. Primarily for folks hired on or after July 1, 2017, they will now have a choice that employees in police and fire systems statewide have never had before, which is they will be allowed to choose between a slightly modified version of the defined benefit pension system that exists today, or they can choose to take a 100% defined contribution plan, which is maybe conceptually similar to a 401k style system, but it's not a 401k. There are a lot of differences between what this system would look like versus a traditional corporate sort of structure. And so they will have a choice between a traditional pension, essentially, or this defined contribution option. And there are a variety of reasons why someone might choose one or the other. we've found not only in Arizona but nationally, the trend for the younger workers, the coming workforce, the millennial generation, et cetera, is that they are looking for a more portable type of benefit, which a defined contribution style structure is really designed to do. That's where the employer makes a contribution, the employee makes a contribution, the employee gets to choose how they want that invested, but once you make that contribution, you're done. Particularly from the employer's perspective, that's a pretty important thing because you don't have the possibility in that system of creating unfunded liabilities. It's a pay once and you're done system.
So it's lowering the risk for the taxpayer.
It is exactly that,
Okay.
Mayor. It is lowering the risk for the taxpayer. Beyond that, there are a number of other changes, and probably the most significant one that is another thing that really has a big impact on lowering risk for taxpayers is a 50-50 cost sharing, equal cost sharing between employers and employees. And when you were describing, or when Pete was describing the tiers earlier, that's one of the main things that differentiates the tier 1 and the tier 2 people from what this new tier 3 will look like. The tier 1 and tier 2 people, the numbers are a little different between them, but basically the employees are capped in terms of what they contribute to the system. So they will contribute up to a certain percent of their paycheck into the pension system, and that's it. And basically everything else goes to the taxpayer or employer side in that situation. And that's why when you see the $72 million in unfunded liabilities that Prescott's facing, and it's $6.6 billion statewide, those liabilities are all on the taxpayer because the employees have basically maxed out what their contributions are going to be to that. And so all that other risk falls on the taxpayer. Well, one of the changes, as Pete described earlier, the incentive structure, changes to the incentives moving forward, is that now in this new tier, you will have full 50-50 cost sharing between employers and employees. So shared risk and shared reward, essentially, in that kind of system. And that really fundamentally changes the dynamic. Beyond that, I think the other key thing to really describe here is what one of the things that the legislation will do is essentially significantly reduce, it won't eliminate outright, but it will significantly reduce the possibility of pension spiking. And pension spiking...
Could you explain what that is?
Exactly. Yes. Pension spiking is a term that is used to describe when someone may, for instance, work a lot of overtime in their last few years of employment. To basically, the way pensions are calculated is you look at a final average salary, and that's what your retirement benefit is based on. And there's been a practice in not only Arizona but nationally in which you create an incentive in that structure to basically artificially increase over and above what your earnings, your salary might have been through overtime, through maybe vacation, payouts, sick leave, that sort of thing, to artificially increase your final average salary in those last years to basically bump up your pension payment above what it would have been if it was just based on your salary. And so right now there is technically a limit in state law of how much of your pay is considered pensionable. It's $265,000. So for most people, that is not a limit at all. This legislation would drop that down to $110,000. And that will make a significant reduction in this phenomenon called pension spiking, which adds costs and liabilities, has added those to this system previously.
So right now what you're telling me then is tier 3 will be capped, but the tier 1 and the few that they're probably there, and the tier 2, they can continue to have pension spiking because the cap doesn't apply to them.
Exactly, because to do so would change the promises that were made to them. That's one of those legal hurdles that we just couldn't get over to make a change in the benefit that they currently receive. But I can't emphasize enough how different the cost sharing, that 50-50 cost sharing is going to be, because as you know, Mayor, in Prescott, if you hired a police officer or firefighter today, they would contribute 11.65% of their salary to their pension. But the city of Prescott's contribution exceeds 70% of their salary. Together, that makes about 82% of their pension. If 50-50 cost sharing were in place now, and they made the same decisions that led them to this bad place that we're at, the city of Prescott's contribution would only be 40% or 41% instead of the 70% it is now. Now, we hope it never gets to that because, quite frankly, you don't want to have an employee having half of their paycheck going out to the pension contributions. But that's why we said it's so important to change the decision-making behavior, because now the representatives on the board of trustees for the pension plan will be very conscious of the fact that their decisions, when they're wrong, just don't go to the deep pockets of a taxpayer that they don't know. This anonymous taxpayer that's going to pay for it in the future. It affects their members, their employees, the people they work side by side with every day. So we believe that that's going to make a striking difference in the decision-making process of the board.
Okay. Well, I think when you talk about defined benefit and defined contribution, hopefully more people go toward the defined contribution. Has this been in practice anywhere else, and have you seen, what result have you seen? Have a lot of the younger folks gone on to defined contribution, or has it been fairly limited?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. In the states that have created defined contribution, whether they're optional or mandatory, you have different structures, but they tend to be fairly popular. And I think the most direct example that's relevant here in Arizona would be our neighbor in Utah, our neighbor to the north, where a few years ago they created even though the benefit structure is a little different, they created a similar choice for new employees, including public safety, between a traditional defined benefit pension or a defined contribution only option. And when you look at what the uptick of the defined contribution side of that has been over the last few years, they've had about just shy of 15% of police and fire personnel statewide that have gone into the defined contribution plan. Which is, it sounds like a low number, maybe in the abstract, but when you think about what government employees, and in particularly public safety, are used to nationally, that's a pretty significant number. And when we were doing the modeling and the sort of actuarial number crunching for this reform, we estimated something much lower. We estimated just a 5%, because we wanted to be very conservative. So we thought 5% of people choosing the defined contribution only option is a very conservative assessment, and we hope we're proven wrong, and that the uptake rate is higher, because as you said earlier, that every additional employee that chooses that over the pension system is reducing the risk exposure to the employers like the city of Prescott, and thereby, by extension, the taxpayers themselves.
Yeah. So the savings to the taxpayers going forward is going to be based, or the increase in savings is going to be based on the greater number of people going into being tier 3, number
Right.
one, and number
right.
2, increasing that savings if they're in defined contribution program.
Yeah, it's really important to note that your viewers understand that the debt that exists now isn't going to go away overnight. That's a debt that the city, and on behalf of the taxpayers, has obligated itself to, and that $72+ million must be paid. But as you mentioned, it will reduce the cost of each new employee that you hire, because the contribution rate for their retirement will be smaller, but you'll take on 50% less risk, or even less, for each employee hired in the future. And for each of those employees, that 15% or so that may elect to go into the defined contribution plan, the city steps away from that risk completely. So overall, you'll see a significant reduction of risk, above 50% reduction.
Okay. And I think you've got 2 charts, one on fire and one on police, where you show the long-range savings that can occur. And of course, early on, it's very minimal. But as we start getting out around 15, 20 years, it starts to expand quite a bit. And I think those would be beneficial for everybody to have an opportunity to take a look at.
Yeah, that really reflects the kind of the hiring life cycle of your employees, because it's not like next year you're going to have everyone retire and hire a whole new crop of people. It will be a slow attrition as new people come in and other people retire, and you'll see the savings in the liabilities as you go forward, and the reduction in risk as well. And that risk reduction is important, because it's the risk that gave you the 70% contribution rates. And by cutting that down, you really constrain that risk, which means the volatility is going to be reduced, which means you'll have more certainty in your budget. That's what it really means. You'll be able to project forward what your budget's going to look like with a lot more security and certainty than you can today.
Right. And obviously, like you say, we have pretty significant debt. And of course, everything you've done right now and all your calculations in which you've talked to the stakeholders and even in what you've presented here, specifically Prescott, didn't take into account any future court cases that could possibly go against the taxpayer. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, there are some, you mentioned earlier that there were some reforms that had been made about 5 years ago, many of which have been challenged in the courts, and you've had the courts actually, most recently the state Supreme Court, striking down significant reforms that were intended to try to fix some of these problems previously. So this isn't the first attempt to deal with this problem, what we're discussing today. Really, we're coming back to the situation again because previous reforms have been struck down by the court. But there are still some other provisions of previous reforms that are still out there in the court system. The Arizona Supreme Court has recently, just a couple weeks ago, heard a more recent case that is still pending out there, that if it were to be decided in a way that would be, I guess, detrimental to the city of Prescott and to the state, would probably add more costs to the system and more unfunded liabilities to the system. So there is the possibility that things could get worse before they get better.
So we'd have more debt.
So you could have more
well
debt.
over the 72 that we have now.
That's right.
That's why we paid so much attention to the legal precedents out there and made sure that every single part of this legislation has been fully vetted for not only what's written in the law, but what's come about via case law across the nation, because the state of Arizona quite simply cannot afford to keep making changes that get thrown out by the court. It has to be done right so that there's real savings and real change.
And I know you mentioned to me in the past that if we could start finding some mechanism in which we could make greater payments, trying to pay it off earlier, that we could have significant cost savings. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, there'll be cost savings in a number of ways. Number one is, with this debt that you have, every year you're accruing interest on it because it's costing more and more as you go forward. Just like if you had a mortgage on your house and you weren't able to refinance it, you're just stuck with that. But also, as you pay down that debt, your contribution rates will go down as well, which will give you that much needed relief you have in your budget. If you were able to, say, find a source of income that could let you pay off this debt in 7, 8, or even 10 years, you would see your contribution rates going from 70% of payroll down to 10%. So basically, for every 2 employees you have on the payroll now, you'd be able to pay for another employee just in the savings that you would get. It's significant.
Okay. So like you say, it's kind of like with your mortgage. If you got a 30-year mortgage and you add additional principal every month, so maybe you only pay it off in 15 years, you can save yourself maybe, several thousand, $100,000 in interest. So that's where we would see a benefit to the people in Prescott.
Right, and you'll be saving millions,
Right.
millions of
Okay.
dollars by
Right.
doing so.
All right. Also, I think it's important to note that you folks not only work on this, but you also help local governments come up with ways to try and remodel the way they do business. Right now we're looking at that for both the police department here in Prescott and the fire department, because obviously, we have a limited amount of funding available for them, and as we try and pay off this debt, we're probably going to have to look at cost savings, from the departments, as well as across, the entire city government. So, can you explain a little bit how you sometimes support, local activities, governments, to try and come up with some kind of cost savings?
Sure.
And remodeling.
Right. Now I'm saying this sort of in the abstract without detailing anything with Prescott. We haven't, spent really much time looking at Prescott specifically, but just generally speaking, we might look to how can you restructure service delivery to be more efficient. That's sort of one path you can go down. You can look to opportunities of how can we partner with the private sector in different ways to try to find cost savings and efficiencies that way, through maybe some types of contracting or looking at private financing of things, that sort of approach. And then you also have assets. Cities and governments own assets. There may be some opportunity there to unlock some value that's trapped currently within public assets that could be better deployed to do something like pay down the types of pension debt that you're looking at here and in other jurisdictions. And so there's no cookie cutter solution. Just like every pension system is its own complex entity, so are city budgets and then their bundles of service delivery. And so each one you kind of have to look at what has been done elsewhere, and that's what we try to do as a think tank that works nationally, but focuses at the state and local level primarily. We try to look at who's done what elsewhere in the country, who's had a success, how can that concept be maybe adapted or modified in another situation. And so that's what that's what we do often, and we're happy to have those sorts of discussions with the elected officials here in Prescott as well.
And Mayor, local governments do a lot of things very well. You see it, your residents see it every day. There's a lot of great things that cities do, but one thing governments in general don't do well is innovate and change. And a lot of the things that you have historically been doing as a city, the world around you may have changed, but the delivery of services have stayed the same. And you really have to look at, are you delivering the same types of service just because you always have? Is that really the best way to serve the residents? And really looking at, how do we meet the goals of the city and the goals of the residents? And has the role of any one department or any one job classification really changed over time? And that'll be the key to finding how you can do things more efficiently.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have to be innovative. I think we're going to have to think out of the box. Obviously, probably would like to have you folks come back at some other point in time and possibly work with the council and the two departments and give us some more of your information and insight on things. And obviously, we're interested in best practices elsewhere. And I know yesterday with Chief Light's briefing, he talked about some of the other formats of service that are in the state. One of them being, having a professional fire department, but also augmented by a volunteer force. And so, by the way, do you know if number of fire departments in the United States that are volunteering, what percentage that might be?
I don't know that number. I should.
Okay.
But it's something that's happening across the nation. There's still many, many communities that rely on volunteer firefighters or, quite frankly, reserve police officers. The city of Phoenix has a large reserve police force, which is essentially a volunteer police force. So there are ways to integrate these into the system.
Okay. And I know when I've talked to people when I was running, and even since I've been installed as mayor, that a lot of people have come forward that have been in police and fire and said they would more than love to come in and volunteer and support the city. So obviously, I think that's one thing we'll have to look at in the future. And like I said, I'd like to invite you back at some point and we can talk about that. I think at this point, we'll go ahead and start our wrap up. Basically, I want to thank you for coming here, both you, Pete, and Lynn. And obviously, we're very appreciative of what the Reason Foundation has done. And I don't think we could have got where we are today without you folks. And Senator Lesko really putting a lot of effort into this, I can tell you. So anyway, for the viewing audience out there, we didn't have the opportunity for it today, but in the future, if you do want to have questions that we can answer while we're in a session here, make sure you go to prescotttoday@gmail.com and provide us your questions. I know there'll probably be a lot of questions that maybe I don't have the answer for, or maybe too many for me to answer during the session, but we'll try and take ones out that are very pertinent to some of the issues that we're trying to address here in the city and answer those for you during those sessions. So thank you for your attendance today, and thank you for coming by.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been our pleasure.